Welcome to Irwin Data Modeler Tool Training. This series is meant to get you up to speed with the tool quickly. In this course, we will begin with what looks like a real data model. We'll quickly move beyond the basic construction. We've seen both the Model Explorer and the action log before in earlier Irwin Data Modeler Tool Training. Now, let's dig deeper. We're going to look at the detailed structure of the Model Explorer. Also, we will investigate its command capabilities. Irwin Data Modeler provides enough navigation options that you can choose your favorites, or let the situation determine which you're going to take this time. Some modelers use the Model Explorer a lot, and some people use it very rarely. I thought I'd dig in a little bit more than we have before. We're on the physical side of a familiar-looking model, and this model targets SQL Server 2016. How do I see that immediately? Way down here on the status bar, SQL Server 2016. So all the objects you see here are objects that are specific, that are physical side, so they're specific to the database management system we've chosen. If we had targeted Oracle for our target server, we would have different choices for a lot of these model objects. We're always going to have tables and entities on the logical side and that sort of thing. So that's one use of the Model Explorer, is to see real quickly which of the specific DBMS objects does Irwin Data Modeler support. You're always going to see tables on the physical side. So let me scroll down to tables and expand that list, the tables branch. We've seen several ways to find things on the screen. Remember from the edit menu, way down at the bottom, go to, which we learned about the hotkey combination, Control G, and the live seek filtering. Well, it's very handy in certain models to be able to look things up alphabetically, especially I'm thinking examples like SAP, which has these very obscurely named tables, because the items, the objects in the Model Explorer are going to be displayed in alphabetical order, whether it's the object type, aggregates, always encrypted keys, annotations, and so forth, or whether it's specific instances. For example, of tables, we have author, back order, book, book author, and so on in alphabetical order. We can pick a table, let's say customer, expand that sub-branch, and see what's been defined for customer. Customer has some columns. Customer has some indexes. It's got a primary key and an inversion entry, and in fact, if we'd like to see the members of one of these, we can keep drilling down, see all the stuff that's associated with our table customer. There are no child relations, meaning relationships in which the selected table customer is a child, but we do have parent relation. This is a relationship in which our selected or current table customer is a parent. It's a relationship from customer to purchase order, and so forth. So you can just find and review aspects of the model. We can also create new objects. Let me create a table. Right-click on the tables branch and select New. And create a new table, WIDGET, widget. And if I right-click on widget, I can add it to the diagram. Oh, that's right. Just because I've created something in here, it may or may not be part of this diagram. And in fact, as soon as I create it, it is not part of the diagram. It is part of the subject area. Let me add to the diagram. And there it is. It puts it right in the middle of my field of vision. So let me move my field of vision a little bit. And now that widget is part of the diagram, let me right-click on it and go to diagram. That means go to this object in this diagram. There is widget. I can edit widget's properties by right-clicking in the Model Explorer and selecting properties. There's widget. And I can add all the properties that we know tables have. Cancel from that. Widget doesn't have any columns yet, but if I expand the widget branch, I can again right-click on columns and say New, just like I did when I created widget. And make widget ID, so on and so forth. I can also use the Model Explorer to delete an object. Let me delete my friend widget. And it's gone from the Model Explorer. Let me undo that deletion and see what that implies. I brought back widget. Now let me select widget and hit the delete button on my keyboard. Do you want them deleted from the model? No. Widget is still listed in the Model Explorer, and this is important. Everything that's in a Model Explorer doesn't necessarily show on this diagram. Everything that's in this diagram does show on the Model Explorer. So by right-clicking in the Model Explorer now and selecting delete, widget's just gone. It's gone from the entire model. I didn't get a warning. I didn't get a double check. So we can create and edit and delete model objects. We can quickly find objects that are associated with the object that we're looking at. Relationships is another interesting branch. Region to store name. Right-click and I can go to that relationship on the diagram. If I had right-clicked on this relationship and saw a request or a menu item, a menu choice, to add to diagram, that would mean that this relationship exists in the model, but it's not shown on this diagram. It exists in the model and it exists in the current active subject area. We can even reset relationship path from here, although of course it doesn't need it, but we can make it need it. I think one of the attractions of the Model Explorer to me is when I get in it, and there's a lot of things that I can do from there, I tend to stay in it and not move back and forth across the diagram. Remember that we can focus on the entire model or just on the subject area, and the drop-down list at the top. Let us pick the subject area of interest. Now this will find all the members of a subject area, not just those that are members in the diagram. So we've taken kind of the next step down into the Model Explorer, kind of exposing each time we come through, we take a little deeper cut. The action log gives us unlimited undo and redo. It even allows us to reverse a single action that we took earlier in the current session. Most people who are new to Irwin Data Modeler find the reverse capability surprising. We've played with the action log in the Irwin Data Modeler. The action log is what gives us the ability to undo and redo, along with the ability to reverse our actions from back somewhere in the middle of a session. Now we're going to practice with these a little and get a little more nuance of how things work. Starting with a brand new empty model, and let me create a few new tables. I'm going to use the trick where I hold down the control key so I can get multiple uses of the toolbar button. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let me fill them with some color. And I'm going to rename E under bar 3 as doodad. Let's take a look at the action log and see what the action log has recorded so far. Let me bring it out here where we can see it. Remember, the action log shows the oldest actions at the bottom of the list. Create model, set model property, logical, physical, view mode, etc. There's a create table. What does that mean? Let me expand it a little bit. Created entity object E under bar 1. That's actually a table. Well, Irwin is very recursive in this. So an entity and a table are two sides of a single coin. Created key group, created the shape object, E/1, and so on and so forth. We can come up through the list. The most recent table we created was E under bar 5. So it's above, it's at the top of our create table actions. Set fonts and colors. The most recent thing we've done to the model was set table property physical name, modified entity object doodad. But let me expand that branch. Change name. New equals doodad, old equals E/3. Remember, E/3 is the physical name for what was shown on the diagram as E under bar 3. And at each of these actions, I can expand and see what all changes were involved. What about creating the object E under bar 5, that most recent table? Well, that involved a lot of changes to the model. And I created a key group. Why? Because every table is going to be required to have a primary key. So it's sitting out here. Value equals PK. And I created a shape. We have to have something to show on a diagram. So there's a tremendous amount of detail that's recorded. Let me collapse the tree again. Let me clean up the action log tree here. Notice, by the way, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but we'll let these soak in here for a little bit. At the bottom left corner of the action log, there are two tabs. Details, which is the one that we've looked at every time we've looked at the action log. And there's a summary. Let's take a look at the summary tab. Session summary. Well, here in the session summary, we're going to see things not necessarily in the order in which they were created by us clicking. We just see the end result. So let me look here for doodad. Well, there we are. By golly, it's in between E/2 and E/4. There's no E/3. There's something called doodad. Why? Well, that's the summary. That's representing the session as it stands now. If you want to see how it got to be this way, we can drill down into as it stands now. But nowhere do we see this creation of E_3 or E/3. We see an object created as doodad. So session summary has its uses. Notice these objects over here can't be undone, redone, reversed. We have to go back to our details tab. And here we see step by step how we did things, not just what we finally accomplished, but how we accomplished it. All right, now let's explore what we came here to look at: undo, redo, and reverse. We know how undo works. We have a button up here in the toolbars. It's in the top left toolbar. Undo. Undo. Watch what happens. Undo. Undo. And look at the action log on the details tab. Grayed out as we've undone the actions. Let's take a look at the summary tab. And once again, let's look for doodad. Specified text was not found. That's because the summary, in other words, as the diagram sits now, or as the model sits now, doesn't contain an object called doodad, and as far as the summary tab is concerned, never did. What we do have is an E_3. So that's how undo works. How does redo work? As I click redo button, keep an eye on the diagram. And watch what's happening in the action log. Those lines we had grayed out are brightening back up. And finally, we'll get the physical name change. Take my word, if we go back to the summary tab and look, we'll see a doodad table there now. Okay, in the action log, I'm going to look at create table for E_or E/4. Let's say that I realize now that was a terrible mistake. I don't need that table, but by now I've got it populated with columns. If all we had were undo and redo, I would have to undo E5, undo E4, and then I'd have to rebuild E5 manually, but we don't have to do that. I can reach down to create table, and I have a couple of choices. Notice in my toolbar at the top, undo to selected transaction, and that's the action that I mentioned before. Of course, we can redo, 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 or I can use the action log to redo to selected transaction, go all the way back up to the top. Well, that undo to here and redo to here, that's nice. It saves me repetition. But really all I want to do is reach back into this basket of things that I've done, and I want to pluck E_4 out of that basket, make it go away like I never created it. I don't want to interfere with anything I've created since, like E_5. So I'm going to go all the way back to create table for E4. I'm going to right click on create table, and this time I'm going to select reverse, and watch what happens to the diagram. It saved me using the undo to here, and it saved me recreating the table E5 and all of its 75 columns and all of its 5 or 6 foreign key constraints, and. Plus, I have a new entry at the top of my action log details. Remove property processing mode from model. Reverse of at create table. Couple of entries here. I wonder if I can undo that. I could use the undo button in my toolbar. Undo, undo. Or I could have done my reverse to here. Notice now, these final 2 entries at the top of my action log, these are the ones that had to do with reversing that change from the middle. I picked up these 2 new actions, and now that I've reversed them, they're grayed out. So I could redo to this point, go back to where I was, undo to this point, and so forth. Over on the summary tab of our action log, none of this messing around that we've just done has had any effect here. There's our entity. It's calling it an entity object. It's a table named doodad. So interesting information difference between the Details tab and the Summary tab. Personally, I find the Details much more useful. I'd like to set the action log back down into the docking point where it was at the bottom left corner. So to go back to where I was, I just double click on the title bar of the action log and there we have it. I hope you find the undo, redo, and reverse capabilities of Irwin Data Modeler Action Log as useful as I find them. Now, with practice, you'll become an expert with Model Explorer and the Action Log. This module has prepared you to develop those skills. Hello again. By now you've seen that this course, Basic Modeling Techniques, goes way beyond just the most fundamental aspects of creating an entity relationship diagram consisting of boxes and lines and little else. Domains are one of the largest concepts that are basic to Irwin Data Modeler. We'll see how domains can function as reusable attributes and columns. Then we'll explore constraints, and we'll see how to apply them to domains. Domains are very interesting objects in an Irwin DM model. Each domain has all of the logical properties of an attribute, plus all of the physical properties of a column. They are inescapable in Irwin Data Modeler, but it's amazing how underutilized they are. So let's see how to utilize them more fully. Did you ever wonder how many more times you might design an attribute column to hold the name of a city? Well, if you know how to use domains in Irwin Data Modeler, the answer will be only one more time, which brings us to the concept of domains. Now, you may be familiar with domains, perhaps a set of allowable values in a data item, or maybe the sense of domains in a more mathematical, a larger context. And it's the second that Irwin refers to when it uses the word domain. The domain in Irwin Data Modeler is a very big concept. We're working here with a model with which we are familiar. We've seen it before. This is from the Publications Applications sample model that is distributed with Irwin. In our friend the Model Explorer, there's a branch labeled Domains. Let's expand a branch, and I see a tree. At the top of the tree is the word Default, and it's in little caret brackets. Right-click on that and take a look. So I can create a new domain. That's interesting. Domains have properties. Oh, do they ever have properties? And I can sort them alphabetically or hierarchically. Wait a minute. Forgetting for a moment that I saw this new up at the top. I have a choice of two different ways to sort, 5 things? That just doesn't make sense. Well, let's see what's in this hierarchy. At the very top, the default domain. When I create a new attribute, I remember from way back in an earlier course where we created attributes and we created columns. And we noticed that each of those was associated with a domain. And we saw the blob domain, binary large object. We saw the date-time domain and the number domain and the string domain. We remember, I hope, the association to a domain. We picked up for our attribute or column a data type and other property values. Well, it looks like date, time, number, and string are expandable here. And I want to drill down into a real Irwin data model and show you what domains are in use. And then we're going to go back to the beginning with a blank screen and build a domain, see how it's useful. Expand the date time branch and I see, there's a domain 2039. Well, it's not very descriptive, but Irwin does provide names by default. Under number, there's something called standard numbers. Expand that. Phone stuff. Expand that. Phone area code, phone number. Well, let's expand phone area code. Fax area code. And expand phone number. Fax number. Why a hierarchy? Well, in Irwin, hierarchies imply inheritance. And that's what's going on here. We have a number of user-defined domains. Irwin provides automatically the domains that we see here: default, blob, date, time, number, and string. Anything else has been defined by a modeler or by a group of modelers. Let's expand string just to say we've been here. There's a city domain, a first name domain, an ID domain, and a few others. I know how this Model Explorer thing works now because I paid attention to the last module. Let's right-click on the city domain and open up its properties. I think I better expand us here a little bit and make room for a wider tree. This tree, the domain parent tree, inside the domain properties editor, another guided editor in Irwin DM, is fully expanded. Shows us everything we need. Our city domain up at the top, look at the list at the top, and I guess while we're here, we should point out again, toolbar, the buttons are specifically appropriate for the object we're working on. And we can type in filter text at the top right if we have a huge list of domains. And you'll see those, but generally the list is not too big. Anywhere from, a dozen or 20, 30, 40, 50, that's very common. Up to maybe 100 or 120, that's unusual. But our city domain, if we look down at the bottom, its parent domain, or domain parent, is string, and we see that in the table of domains at the top. And because it's associated with the string domain parent, our user-defined domain of city has a logical data type of varchar20. It gets that directly from string. It's not logical only. Why not? Because string isn't logical only, and we have not overridden this property. All these properties, you're used to this by now, inherited though they may be, they can be overridden. And we see the properties from this table at the top in the left side of the leftmost panel, general. Logical only, logical data type, and notice a little inheritance button picture out to the left. Logical only is inherited. It could be overridden. Logical data type, varchar20, that's inherited. But our null option, it was inherited, but it's been overridden. So that although string by itself would not allow nulls, city, which has string as its parent, has had that property overridden. So city domain will allow nulls. On the right side of the general tab, we see more information. We see the name. This is the logical name, by the way. We see the default string icon. Inherited or overridden. Do you remember what that button picture means? Inherited. Attribute name, %att domain. What in the world? Irwin has a macro language, a scripting language. We're going to see those at work later on in the advanced modeling techniques courses. Attribute image, the icon picture, button picture, whatever, that's also inherited. Let's take a look at our constraint tab. We have two constraints, a check constraint, otherwise known as a validation rule. Use inherited constraints, but there are none. And we see a default constraint on the right side of the constraint tab. Definition tab, there's no definition, but we're going to play with that a little bit in just a few minutes. Where used, wherever I see it, I like to click on it. It's just wonderful. User-defined properties. Aha. Domain user-defined properties. There are none. But look at the bottom. User-defined properties inherited by attributes. Or does this mean when I associate an attribute with a city domain, that attribute will automatically pick up a create date user-defined property and a definition source user-defined property? Yes, it does. That's exactly what it means. Notes and extended notes. Wow, that's a lot to take in. I'm going to cancel out of here, and I'm going to go back to a blank sheet of paper. Just accept the defaults, logical and physical. Let's see what we have for domains here. We have default, blob, date, time, number, and string. That is all. I'm going to do this in a very straightforward way. I'm going to build two entities. Let me name the first entity employee and the second entity customer contact. Of course, you remember how we build attributes. We can build an attribute for employee called employee city name. And we could build another attribute for customer contact called customer contact city name. And over and over and over and over, how many times are we going to rebuild new city name attributes and columns? The answer is just one more. Do you remember what that looks like when we build an attribute in the attribute properties editor? We create a new one up here, name it city, choose a parent domain for it, so on and so forth. Now, till the mental image of this screen, we're looking at the entity properties editor and cancel. Let me now look at the domains properties editor. Well, I can't look at it directly from the top of the branch, can I? And this is the way the Model Explorer works. City name column. Let's see, that's going to be a string. So let me right click on string and take a look at the string properties, the string domain properties. This is as we saw in the bigger model, except we only have one domain parent called default, and the other possibilities, blob, date, time, number, and string. Now that I have the domain dictionary open, think of this as editing the domain properties, I can build a new domain. Let me push the new domain button. Now, yes, there was a choice in the Model Explorer, right-click, and then pick New. But I want to emphasize how similar the domain dictionary editor is to the attribute editor on the logical side and to the column editor on the physical side. This domain, 172, see where Irwin Data Modeler has already put it in our tree at the bottom, call this city name. It's associated with the string domain, which means by default it gets a varchar 20 data type. My experience of varchar 20 isn't going to be big enough for all the city names. Let me make that varchar 26, just so it stands out. It should be obvious when we see varchar 26 that somebody's made it 26 on purpose. Now check the General tab. Under Domain Parent, we see the parent is string. Yes, that's true. City name's not its own parent. So what we want checked here is the parent domain. And at the bottom left, logical only, no. Logical data type, varchar 26, that little button picture means overridden. It's got a pencil on it. And it is nullable. On the Definition tab, we have two definitions. The one at the top pertains to the domain, the definition of the city name domain, our standard data element for the full name of a city. Definition inherited by attributes. Well, attributes are going to inherit the data type from the domain. Why couldn't they inherit a definition? And a little bit of a trick here. The full name of the city in which, and a trick. I'm going to introduce you to Irwin's macro scripting language. Percent owner entity is located. Now if that works, that's going to be pretty cool. Percent owner entity is a macro command that will return the name of the entity that owns this attribute. The attribute could be inherited as a foreign key, so owner entity will track back to find the entity from which that foreign key originated. That's the meaning of percent owner entity. And let's close. So now we could build our attributes in employee and customer contact, our city name attributes, and associate them with that new user-defined domain. But it's easier than that. Now that I have my city name domain inheriting from string, I'm going to drag a copy of city name. Remember, we can do this with entities or tables when we're populating a diagram. There's city name for employee, and I'm going to create one for customer contact, city name. Now I'd like to open the attribute properties editor and see what we have. Did we get our varchar 26? We did indeed get varchar 26 for city name. Let me try the other entity in our drop-down list at the top. Customer contact, yes, it is also varchar 26. What about the definitions? The full name of the city in which customer contact is located. Now this inheritable definition, by nature, it's got to be boilerplate, right? Because you want it to be useful. It's a default. It doesn't mean that it's always going to completely suit every situation. Maybe it's not the full name of the city in which the customer contact is located. Maybe it's the full name of the city in which the customer resides. Maybe it's the full name of the city in which the customer contact receives packages. But you get the idea. This is modifiable. Let me change this to the full name of the city in which customer contact resides. And close. Let's open up employee again. Attribute properties. Our definition for city name in employee entity is located. But let's switch entities to customer contact, the full name of the city in which customer contact resides. So we have overridden the inherited full name of. And that's pretty cool. Now I'm going to change things up a bit. Open up properties for our string domain, in other words, all of them. And I'm going to create a new domain. This domain will be called standard string. Standard string has as its parent the string domain. Why do I want standard string? Well, let's take a look at them for a minute. Everything that inherits from string will inherit the attribute name %att domain. But I don't want that. I want a different naming rule. We haven't delved into these, and we're not going to delve very deeply right now, and we're going to explore the macro naming language just a little bit. Now I'm going to make another domain called state abbreviation. And right now it's inheriting from standard string because, well, standard string was highlighted and checked. Standard string. So standard string is a place I don't want to change the basics of the very most basic 5 domains that Irwin Data Modeler includes. So I'm going to build a sandbox for myself to play in. Standard string inherits all of its stuff from string, but I'm going to change its attribute naming rule. I'm going to insert in front of %ATT domain, %owner entity, and a space. Now the space will be interpreted as a literal space because it's not preceded by a %sign. %owner entity, we know what that does already. And %ATT domain is the logical name of a domain. We haven't seen it yet, but domains have a logical name and a physical name. We're looking at all the properties of an attribute here. We're on the logical side of the domain. So everything now that inherits from standard string should inherit this attribute naming rule. Let's see if state abbreviation does. I'm going to take a look at the state abbreviation in the domain dictionary editor. Yep, it does. State abbreviations aren't varchars. No, they're a different type of data altogether. char2. Anything else we want to change about state abbreviation? No. Let's close. Now let's see what happens when we drag state abbreviation. I'm not going to build the definition. We understand how those work. Maybe drag state abbreviation into employee and into customer contact. Now I've left the all caps survive here in employee, but yes, there is a nice little macro command, %lower, that would make all this stuff lowercase. But we have other ways to deal with that as well. You'll see those later. How many more times will I create a new city name or a new state abbreviation attribute? Exactly once. Let's take a peek at the physical side of our model and open up a column properties editor. On the general tab, we see all of our friendly domain parents. No big surprises here. But let's open up the domain dictionary editor on the physical side. These are all the physical properties that a domain can have, in fact does have. But we're still looking at domains. Special SQL Server stuff, permissions, comments as opposed to attribute definitions. But look at this. Did you ever wonder why, by default, when you create an object, logical physical attribute column, that the comment for the column is exactly the same as the definition you typed in for the attribute, at least at the beginning? Well, here's the reason why. Columns, by default, according to all of Irwin's default, not user-defined, all the provided domains, the comment inherited by columns is %ATT-def, and I bet you can guess what that means. Attribute definition. So, domains. Each domain has all of the properties of an attribute and all the properties of a column, including a logical name for the domain, a physical name for the domain, and all these inheritable things. It's a wonderful, wonderful, powerful, enormously powerful thing. Again, once we introduce R1DM's macro language in the Advanced Modeling Techniques course, then we'll be able to name attribute and column names automatically through inheritance from the domain, get all the casing correct, and so forth. If enforcing a standard for naming, a standard for data type, and so forth, for a whole set of very fundamental attributes and columns, if enforcing that standard makes it this easy to construct a model, who wouldn't want to do it? Validation rules, which are constraints on the physical side, are model objects in Irwin Data Modeler. Therefore, as with domains, you may build them one time and use them many times. In fact, we'll see in one of the advanced courses how to make them reusable model to model. So you can begin your second model with all these things that you want to use frequently in modeling already built in. We've just talked about a very valuable, reusable model-level object in Irwin called the domain. Now we're going to take a look at constraints, validation rules, which also are model-level objects in Irwin. You can create them. And reusable, available for use in whatever tables, entities you prefer. We're looking here at our old friend, the Publications application database. And I want to take a look at some validation rules that are already here. Model Explorer shows we have 2 of them. area codes, and state codes. Well, let's open up the properties editor for area codes, which of course gives us all of the validation rules in the list at the top. Area codes. Type. Notice we have a choice of user-defined, which would be some complex SQL if that were the requirement. Min-max defines a range, or valid values, which is a list of allowed values for area codes. We have a general tab, a definition tab. We know what that's for. A where used tab, user-defined properties, notes, and extended notes. On the general tab, this is a list of valid values, which is exactly what we see here at the bottom. There's just a small handful of values that we're going to allow. Notice the expression at the bottom, including the Irwin macro %ATT field name. So we're going to allow 201, 212, 215, 732, or 908. When you see Irwin macro code like this, one of the things that it can do is generate custom DDL. And that's exactly what this is going to do, isn't it? Let's take a look at the toolbar for our valid values. We can sort the items, build a new valid value, just like that. Throw out a valid value, just like that. Move an item down one in the list, or move it all the way to the bottom of the list. Or if we were anywhere except the top item, move it up or move it all the way to the top. And the rightmost button, import. Would you like to merge CSV contents into the current list? No, I don't have such a CSV, but this could be very interesting. Although really, how big of a check constraint would you consider? What about 100 values in a check constraint? Probably looking at some other way to implement that. Nonetheless, if you have a list out there, you could bring it in. Let's take a look at our state code valid values. There's the type again. And here we have Alaska, Arizona, California, Delaware, Florida, New Jersey, New York, Texas, and Virginia. The display value column, you won't see this in the DDL script, but it's handy for client-side information. Definition, in order to enter a definition, you have to open up the little editor. Okay, very good. How do we apply this state code? Well, we don't have any state code columns out here or attributes. We do have a domain called state code. Let's see what that's like. State code, it's a char2 data type. It inherits from standard string. Here's the naming rule for state code. Notice a new macro command to you. Now, what's that? 3% upper. And that's going to take everything between the left paren here and the right paren and force it to uppercase. That makes sense according to our state code validation rule. Let me make a new attribute. We're on the logical side of the model, dragging a state code domain into the very bottom of customer. So the name is all uppercase. That's not what I want. I want the contents to be all uppercase. So I'm going to have to go back and fix my state code. Fix my domain. Get rid of that % upper. Close. Well, customer's still in uppercase. Why? Because we said use the name of the entity. Okay, and we'll find a way around that some other day. Now, how do we apply the state code validation rule to our new customer state code attribute? Open up the properties editor for customer state code. And on the constraint tab, use inherited constraint for check constraints or validation rules. Oh, well, we don't have an inherited constraint. So if I clear the use inherited constraint box, now I can choose from my list of validation rules. State code. Since state code is reusable, Irwin generates a unique name for it every instance. But this use inherited constraint, that's kind of interesting. This will do the job, but it will only do it for this one state code attribute column. You know, I'm just going to cancel out of this. Go back to my state code domain. State code, char2. I'll go to the constraint tab, and here it says use inherited constraint, but that would mean the constraint that state code inherited from standard string, its domain parent. I don't want to do that. So I'll clear the use inherited constraint box, drop my validation rule list, and pick state code. Notice at the bottom of the list, and this is important because sometimes this is where you'll find the new button. Down at the bottom of a list, if you want to make a new validation rule from right here, you can launch it from right here. These check constraint usage properties are DBMS specific, so we'll just ignore that for now. Let me close my domain editor and open up customer state code in the attribute editor. Use inherited constraint, and just to make clear what that constraint is, it's named right here for us on the attribute editor. Very interesting. If we would forward engineer this and take a look at the DDL script, we would see our constraint. Here's an important warning. Valid values. These happen to be all 2-character alpha values, don't they? Well, just for fun, let me go up to my domain. And I'm going to change my domain. Instead of inheriting from standard string, I'm going to inherit from standard number, which makes the data type integer. Let me close and go back to the validation rules. They don't complain. The list of valid values here no longer matches the data type for the state code domain. But the domain doesn't complain, and the validation rule does not complain either. All the way up until you generate the DDL script. It still won't complain until you pass that DDL script to SQL Server 2016 in this case, and SQL Server says, "What are you trying to do?" But that's not something important you need to remember. I always suggest running a test generation directly from Irwin into a test database, a test schema. We can use SQL Server in this case for our debugger. Very, very useful. Well, I'm going to put state code back where I had it originally, inheriting from standard string. And there we go. Validation rules and check constraints. Logical side, physical side. Default values, which I mentioned are called constraints on the physical side, are model objects in Irwin Data Modeler. Remember, that means that you can build them once and reuse them over and over again, just as with validation rules. Let's look now at default values. These default constraints are model level objects in Irwin. We see default values as its very own branch in the Model Explorer, and we have a number of them defined. There's a default value called state code. That matches the state code validation rule that we used before. Let's take a look at that from the Model Explorer, right-click, and Properties. Well, most of our business activities in this fictitious publications firm take place in New Jersey. The default state code is just the one that we're going to use most times, NJ. Let's change that. I'm going to change it to KY, and I'm going to close it and reopen it right away. Irwin didn't complain, but SQL Server will complain. You need to have single quotes around this value. We did not need to provide them in the list of validation rule valid values, but we do need to provide them here in the default. Irwin fills them in over there in the validation constraints, but it doesn't fill them in here. Now, how might this apply? Let's close, having added the single quotes. Let's take a look at our customer state code attribute. Let's select customer state code in our attribute editor, and we see on a constraint tab a check constraint that we used last demo, state code. It's inherited. And we say we're going to inherit the default value, but as we know, our friend does not have a default value to inherit. Customer state code comes from the state code domain, created by or created through the state code domain, and that domain does not pass on a default value. So let me clear this and drop down my list of defaults. Pick state code or make a new one. If I push that new button, what's it going to do? It's going to launch my default values editor exactly right. I'm going to pick state code here. Now close. KY. Okay, all set. Irwin loves it. But let's go take a look at our validation rule for state codes. Our list of valid values. Guess what's not here? No KY. That's right. Now, this might seem like a terrible oversight, but really, imagine all of the internal checking that Irwin would have to do for all of the different DBMSs it supports if it were to validate your SQL all the time. There is a way to validate the SQL. There's even an internal way to validate the SQL. We'll look at that later on. But the big-time way of validating the SQL is to generate a test schema through, in our case, SQL Server 2016, down at the bottom right on the status bar. And that's going to be our ultimate debugger. Irwin created a way to interact very nicely with the schema generation. And we can receive in Irwin error messages, in our case from SQL Server, at schema generation time. We can interrupt the schema generation, go fix the problem, pick the schema generation back up from the query that failed, and go on to the end. And that's a whole lot simpler than building a dozen or so enormous debuggers into Irwin. Plus, you can't disallow during development everything that might ultimately be disallowed at schema generation time. I mean, then you're stuck with a which came first, the chicken or the egg. What if I make my default value rule before I make my validation constraint rule? Well, I've got to allow everything then. And without really constraining the way we build models, Irwin has, I think, an excellent solution. Domains, validation rules, and default rules, all reusable objects in Irwin Data Modeler, can speed your work tremendously. They can also improve the quality and consistency of your models. I've always said that if you can make standards in a way that the use of them can benefit the people who build the models, there won't be any argument. Everybody wants to use the standards all of a sudden. And that's what I think we've tried to do with Irwin Data Modeler. Even with all the properties that Irwin Data Modeler provides for the various kinds of model objects, there may be other metadata that you'd like to track. We've already seen the use of notes and extended notes to track unstructured metadata. Well, Irwin DM provides user-defined properties, or UDPs, to track more structured metadata. We're going to see how to do that. Well, let's take a look at some user-defined properties in a model with which we are familiar. I'm going to open the Entity Properties Editor for the customer entity. And on the UDP tab, notice I have two user-defined properties for the customer entity. Let's take a look at, discount, just any other entity. We have the same two user-defined properties. All right, going back to customer. The user-defined properties are data steward and STDABBR. I presume that stands for standard abbreviation, which is a cute way to name standard abbreviation. Stacy, way over to the right end of the data steward UDP. Click that drop down, and we see that Stacy is one of several choices. Steve A., Allie, Paul, etc. Stacy's name has a tilde character in front of it, which makes it the default. If it were not for that tilde character, the default would be Steve A because he's first in the list. I'm fond of making the default explicit with the tilde character. Just for fun, let's change the data steward for the customer entity from Stacy to Tony. Now Tony's recorded as the data steward for the customer entity. What about book order entity? Stacy's still the data steward here, which is exactly what we want. At the top left of the UDP tab, in our Entity Editor, there's a toolbar button for User-Defined Properties Editor. And here we see Data Steward with a list of names and standard abbreviation. Now this is the definition. This is where we define our user-defined properties. Notice we have many types: integer, text, date, command, etc. We're going to build a user-defined property of the command type in a few minutes. And in the default column, we see not just the default, but in fact, whatever entry is here for a list, all the entries. Let's add somebody to the end here. Let's add Casey. Now we're changing the user-defined property. Let's check the definition for STDABBR to make sure our assumption is correct. And yes, the corporate standard abbreviation used for table and column naming. Close. Now back on the Entity Guided Editor, let's take a look at the data steward for the entity customer. Drop down list is still set to Tony, but notice that Casey is now on our list. Standard abbreviation here on the Entity Guided Properties Editor. For customer, I just don't think it should be our default. Remember, this is the default, XYZZY. Standard abbreviation for the customer entity will be CUST. And let's change it for discount. So for customer, Tony is the data steward. CUST is standard abbreviation. For discount, Stacy is the data steward. And DISC is the standard abbreviation. Let's build a new user-defined property. We know how to do that, right? Have to open up the guided editor for user-defined properties. I'll do it from right inside the Entity Properties Editor. We know how to make new things by clicking on the New button. And once again, Irwin gives us a default name. I'm going to call this one, all caps, URL. I want to make it a command data type. I think the other data types are self-explanatory, but not necessarily command. Command is any valid Windows command. There's no default, so I will type in https://www.startpage.com. But if I type it in here in the User-Defined Properties Editor, it's going to become a default. Do I really want that as a default? I don't think so. Let me backspace that out. So we just create the UDP, give it some default value if we want. We don't have to assign a default. I decided not to assign a default for URL. For the discount entity, I'm going to type our URL. Now we've got the URL, a value for it for discount. Not for customer, not for book return, not for back order. It's important to remember which editor you're in, or you'll wind up changing a default value instead of changing a specific instance. Well, here we are in the Entity Properties editor for discount with a URL value. Way over at the right end of the URL field, we have two buttons. One is a magnifying glass, which will take us to where we want to go, and the other is a little folder with a page in it. The magnifying glass launches Internet Explorer in my case, and the Start Page search engine. Put that away. What about the file folder? Well, the file folder just opens a Windows Explorer. So if there's something out there that we want to look up that we can find in Windows Explorer, we can load it into the URL value for a particular entity. Let me move to the entity customer at another very commonly used URL, excel.exe. Here we are. So if you have a lot of metadata, it's not very well structured. Maybe it's a spreadsheet. In fact, I've seen an organization who kept track of all of the changes that they made to a model and how those changes related to their change management system using a set of spreadsheets. And for each entity, they had the name of that particular spreadsheet along with the excel.exe. So we can load the particular spreadsheet. Very, very handy. User-defined properties, making sure that you have the right metadata in the right place for the right people at the right time. Now, I hope you're thinking of all the user-defined properties you'd like to create for your models. But remember the old joke that the two biggest problems with metadata are, first, not enough metadata, and second, too much metadata. The correct amount is whatever's important to the model for some purpose, such as governance. Don't just throw UDPs here and there because you can. They'll fall into disuse. However, judicious use of UDPs can be a very great improvement to your models. Irwin Data Modeler uses a mechanism called a transformation to resolve necessary differences between the physical model and the logical model. Differences arise between the logical and physical sides of an Irwin data model because of non-relational structures, such as many-to-many relationships and generalization hierarchies, which are also called supertype-subtype relationships. Well, let's reconcile the logical side of an Irwin data model with the physical side using a transformation. Here's our familiar model. On the logical side, we have a many-to-many relationship between author and book. Each author writes 0, 1, or more books, and each book can have any number of authors, but not 0. So that's the big problem with many-to-many relationships, is they hide a lot of information. Let's take a look at how Irwin shows this on the physical side, just by clicking the Physical Diagram tab. Author and book, and we see here book author. This is called an association table, sometimes a join table. Irwin provides this join table automatically. The join table primary key consists of foreign keys inherited from the two ends of the many-to-many relationship. So the join or association table associates a specific book with a specific author. But on the logical side, let me go back to the logical diagram, Irwin leaves this alone. One reason for maintaining the many-to-many would be this might be the way the organization sees this relationship. It doesn't really see that association of one author and one book, depending on what part of the organization you're dealing with. Well, how would we run a transform on this? First, we have to select the relationship that we want to transform, and all transformations are done on relationships. So here I've selected the many-to-many relationship line on the logical diagram. From the Actions menu, look at Transformations and look at my choices. Resolve all transformations. This means in the entire model. The only choice that's not grayed out is Resolve Many-to-Many Relationship. And it is bright for us because, of course, we highlighted it. Let's take a look at the other types of transformations. There's a horizontal partition. In Irwin, you can define partitions. It's especially useful if your DBMS does not support the kind of partition you have in mind, either horizontal or vertical partition. But if the DBMS does, I'd be inclined to recommend that you use the partitioning provided by the DBMS. Nonetheless, this is a valuable opportunity. Supertype-subtype relationships. If you're familiar with those, you know that they're not relational. They can't be built in a relational database. So we have got to resolve them somehow. We can roll all the subtypes up into the supertype, or we can roll the supertype information down into each of the subtypes. That would be our supertype-subtype roll-down transformation. Another possibility for generalization hierarchies or supertype-subtype relationships is to resolve it to an identity relationship, where there's a 1 to 0 or 1 relationship between the supertype and each of the subtype entities. We can roll down any two tables, combine the parent and the child, for example. We can roll up the child into the parent, as many copies of it as we need into the parent. All these issues are non-relational. How do we implement some non-relational sort of a thing in a relational database? But we're not covering partitioning or supertype-subtype relationships. Let's see what happens when we resolve the many-to-many relationship. Well, something happened. Here's book author. We have a mess with our relationship lines, do we not? Well, let's fix those relationship lines referring to our layout tools. I'm going to lasso and select author, book, and book author. And then in the layout tools, I'm going to use the one that's fifth from the left end. It just resets relationship paths that are selected. Click. And there we go. It doesn't move any of the boxes around. A wonderful layout button. So here we have the logical side of the model, and click on the physical tab. The physical side of the model, and except the layout is different, the tables and relationships are the same here as the entities and relationships on the logical side. So I know that we have tracked this information in our action log, reorder diagram table, reorder set location, there we go, resolve many-to-many association transformation. But that goes away at the end of the session. How is this information maintained? I'm going to open up the Entity Properties Editor for book author, our associating entity. And on the History tab, I see an event recorded, transformed. Specific description. Let me rearrange the columns so that we can read that description. Transformed by many-to-many relationship from book and author. And it gives us information about the path. So a transformation is considered an historical event, an important event in the life of an entity. And of course, this is how this entity arose, book author. So we talked about transformation. They're under the Actions menu. A lot of other very interesting stuff that we're going to cover in the Advanced Modeling Techniques courses. We've talked about the various kinds of transformations, and we performed a many-to-many resolution. Now the logical side, as I like to say, looks like it was designed this way from the beginning, until you dig into the history of this association entity. Note that transformations are not required. Use them when they suit your purposes. For example, sometimes we'll want the differences to remain so that we can show the way the logical side was developed. In Module 5, we will work with ready-made reports in the Irwin DM Report Designer. We'll also build a simple but useful report. The Report Designer has numerous ready-made reports. They're called pinned reports. They're a good starting point for learning how to build comprehensive reports in the tool, and they're useful in their own right. By learning the operations in this demo, you'll be able to construct simple models using the basic features of Report Designer. We'll cover advanced features in our Workgroup Modeling Administrator course. From the Tools menu, select Report Designer, and let's take a look at some of the pinned reports that are included. From the File menu in the Irwin Report Designer dialog, select Open Pinned Reports. We have the location of the report repository, and then a list of report categories. Let's take a look at that list. Many different types of reports. One of my favorites is model validation reports. Let's take a look at some of these. Attribute with no definition. Migrated attributes only. Let's scroll down a little bit. Domain that is not used. Entity with no primary keys. So here's a whole collection of reports that can help you keep track of things you might otherwise miss in a serious report development project. Well, all the way back up at the top of our list of sample model validation reports here, I'm going to take the very first one, the attribute attached to default domain. Show me all of the attributes that are associated with the default domain. The default domain is just kind of a placeholder. When we create a new attribute or a new column using on-screen editing, it is automatically assigned to the default domain. But we need to go through those attributes and columns later and associate them with their correct domain, whether it's one of the built-in IRWIN-DM domains or a custom domain. I'm going to select that report and click OK. We can take a look at the construction of the report over here in the little Report Explorer. And for any of these items, for example, the attribute name item, right-click on that and select Properties. These are all the items for a similar report component that when you build a custom report, you either have to accept defaults for or make your own selections, override the defaults. It's a good thing they're reusable, isn't it? Lots of details. This is just one branch. Cancel out of that. From the menu in IRWIN Report Designer dialog, click on Export, and we're going to do the Run Report. Notice the arrow underneath this little worksheet, kind of a button picture. We also have the opportunity to export it to text, export to HTML, or export to PDF. I just want to look at the report right here, so I'm going to Run Report, and here we go. I'd like to have this result set shown in order by the entity name. So I point my cursor to the entity name column header, give a click, boom, everything's sorted. Well, according to this report, the attribute name contract in a table named author is associated to the default domain. Let's see if that's true. Here's the author table. Let me open up column properties. There's contract. Yes, indeed. Default domain. It's a small int data type, so at the very least, it should be associated to which of the built-in IRWIN domains? Number. Let me cancel the column editor, and notice that my report dialog is parked down here at the bottom left corner. It's not docked. Let me maximize it. Ooh, that's too much. Back down a little bit. Pretty good, and a long list of these model validation reports. Okay, well, that's how to use pinned reports. And you've seen a little bit of the structure of Report Designer reports. Let me just close the IRWIN Report Designer dialog, and don't save changes when I'm closing. All right, let's create a new report template now. Once again, from the Tools menu, select Report Designer to open the IRWIN Report Designer dialog. We have menus and lots of button pictures in the menus. I'm using the menu here to make the movement a little more explicit. It's hard to follow the cursor on an individual button. New report. We're going to name this report Subject Area Contents. The report type will be Logical Physical. Now we have two tabs. Better fix my spelling first. We have two tabs, Report Designer and Definition. Of course, we'd want to type some kind of a definition. Report Design. We need to select the report subject. Select Report Subject. There's Subject Area. And as I single click on Subject Area, and the report subject, the panel on the right is populated with the choices I can make for a report whose subject is subject areas. So now to select report fields in the panel on the right. Under subject area order by, I'm going to select alphabetic order. Under subject area properties, I'll select name. Is this a big tree? Yes, it is. But notice the other kinds of fields that we report on. ER diagram, extended notes, members. So let me collapse the tree. I can see with the black square dots in the order by and properties branches that I've made some selections there. Under ER diagram, expand that branch. Order by, alphabetic order. So we're sorting the subject area, and then we're going to sort within the subject area, we're going to sort the diagrams in alphabetic order. And under ER diagram, properties that we want to report upon will include, oh, what a list. Way down here, name. Once again, I think I better collapse my tree or it's going to get out of hand. And collapse the ER diagram branch. Now, under members, subject area members, all the way at the bottom of that subject area tree, members, entity / view. So what do I want to include? What do I want the content to be? Under entity / table, order by. So within each entity or table, I want to be in alphabetic order. So I'm going to have alphabetic order by subject area, within a subject area by diagram name, and within a diagram by entity or table name, alphabetic order. Well, good, but what information specifically do we want about entities and tables? Expand the properties branch as before, and we'll take name. Click OK. In the Report Explorer, let's take a look to confirm our template design. Expand the branches, and indeed we can see the content is going to be entity or table, names in alphabetic order by entity, and within an ER diagram in alphabetical order by name, and in the subject area, diagrams in alphabetical order by the diagram name. I'm pretty happy with that layout, so under the File menu, I'll select Save Solution As. I'm going to call this SA Contents. Notice the extension ERPS, that's an Irwin Report Solution file, and save. I already had one of those. All right, so I built a template. I've confirmed its construction. Now I'm ready to try something. From the Export menu, I can click Run Report or use the Toolbar button. Click. There we have a report. Notice the first row here, Book. Remember, we're filtering by subject area here on the left. The Book subject area has a diagram called Logical, another diagram called Physical. On the logical diagram of the book subject area, there's an entity named Author. In the book subject area, on the diagram named Physical, we have Book, Book Year-to-Date Sales, and Publisher. Notice under Book, we only have one table, or one entity rather, on the logical side, but we have 1, 2, 3 tables on the physical diagram. Remember that region at the top of our results where it says drag a column header here to group by that column? Let's see how that works. The column header they're talking about is the column header just below. The column headers we have are name, name, and name. Of course, they're different names of different things. The leftmost column is the name of subject areas. Please take a close look at the way things go in that column. For the subject area book, we have book, 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 book. So for each row of the report that deals with the book subject area, the name of the subject area book appears here. For each column, it says drag a column here to group by that column. So to group by the name of the subject area, we drag the header for the subject area name right from where it is, right here at the top of the column. I'm clicked on that and I'm going to drag it right up here into the grouping area. Notice the two red markers. Click. There we go. And now instead of book, 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 we have grouped under the subject area name book, logical, author, physical, book, book, year-to-date sales, publisher, and so forth. Gives a nice appearance. Makes it easy to glance down through a long report and find where you're going immediately. Well, maybe I don't like that. I'm going to click on the name that I just dragged up there into the group by area, drag it back down into the column region. Oh, look at the two markers. I can place it at the left, or in place the second column, or in place the third column. And of course, just as in Excel worksheets, for example, you can move the columns. You can do so here. I want it at the leftmost column. Click. And we're back to the original appearance. Of course, right-clicking will give us access to the properties for subject areas. And everything below subject area. This is the report design. I love a PDF. Let me export to PDF. And a checkbox at the bottom left corner to open after exporting. Prepared and it's exported. Table of contents. Notice what happens. If I'd like to see the test subject area, point to it and click. So the menu is all hot linked in our PDF. Isn't that cool? Very nice looking report. All tabularized at the end. And indexed. And the index is hot also. So if I'd like to see the information about order item, a table, order shipment, a table, or order, a subject area, I just point to one of the blue highlighted page numbers here and see its tabular report. Okay, let's put that away, but that's a little bit of fun. If we'd like to reuse our template someday, let me close out of here without saving. Tools, Report Designer, From the File menu, I'll open a solution. Here's my SA Contents, ERPS, open, and Run Current Report. Ta-da! So now you should be able to explore the very most basic kind of reports that you can build in Irwin DM's Report Designer. Construct some on your own. Don't forget the wonderful pinned reports that you have available already. Well, now you've seen the Report Designer, you can put many pinned reports to immediate use. You're also equipped to explore the construction of more complex or custom reports.